Today we have with us Dr. Aswin, Punathambekar, and Mr. Sriram Mohan, and they will be talking about a framework for studying global digital cultures, infrastructures, platforms, and publics. Dr. Aswin Punathambekar is Associate Professor in the Department of Media Studies, University of Virginia. His research and teaching focus on the impact that globalization and technological change have on the workings of media industries, formations of audiences and publics, and cultural identity and politics. His latest book is Media Industry Studies, Quality 2020, co-authored with Dr. Daniel Herbert and Professor Amanda Lawrence. He serves as an editor of the peer-reviewed journal Media Culture and Society and co-edits the Critical Cultural Communication book series for NYU Press. His talk today is based on his open access book 2019 by University of Michigan Press, Global Digital Cultures, Perspectives from South Asia with Mr. Sriram Mohan. Sriram Mohan is a PhD candidate in the Department of Communication and Media and Rackham Predoctoral Fellow at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. His research examines digital media cultures, political expression, and state-citizen relationships in South Asian contexts. His work has appeared in journals like Television and New Media and International Journal of Communication, among others. He serves as an associate editor of the peer-reviewed journal Bioscope, South Asian Stream Studies. A link to their latest book will be in the chat shortly. Hello, Ashwin sir. Hello, Sriram. Welcome. Over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you all for this very kind invitation to participate in what seems like a fantastic series of roundtable talks. And thank you all for organizing everything so amazingly well. We know how much work behind the scenes labor these sorts of events involve, especially on the part of graduate students. So thank you all for doing this. And we're really excited to be presenting parts of our book. And I should just say that it's lovely to see so many participants, lots of familiar faces, and we look forward to hearing from others on this chat as well down the road.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Today, we'd like to share with you a framework that we've been developing for the systematic study of digital media cultures in South Asia and beyond. This presentation distills an argument out of a series of articles and research projects culminating in the book that Aswin and I have worked on over the past 4 to 5 years. Our work is grounded in a media and cultural studies approach in the critical humanistic tradition. And we frame digitalization as part of a 30-year-long historical transformation of media technologies, media practices, and media cultures. And while our regional focus is South Asia, we frame our arguments as contributions to the broader terrain of global media studies.
So we wanted to begin by first raising the question of what does it mean to locate digital between two keywords that have animated humanistic and social scientific work for well over 3 to 4 decades, global on the one hand and culture on the other. And we wanted to give a sort of quick overview of this particular angle to say that one key insight is that we want to acknowledge and account for digital media as having emerged from and as part of processes of economic and cultural processes that have unfolded at least since the late 1970s, but gaining steam beginning in the mid to late 1980s in the Indian context and a little bit differently in other parts of South Asia. Second, in doing that, what we want to do is foreground the fact that digital cultures are shaped by distinct but often disjunct temporalities within the same nation space or within a particular region. So to give you one quick example, if you think about the early 2000s in the Indian context, digitalization was shaped as much by speculative economies of boom and bust .com economies as it was by global development agencies funneling in many projects, thousands of dollars invested in ICT for development kinds of initiatives. And between those two ends of the spectrum, many other modes of digitalization were unfolding throughout the 90s and 2000s. And finally, what we wanted to do before we delve into our presentation a bit more is to step back and think a bit more expansively about digital media as part of an ongoing and ceaseless remediation of public cultures, to not set up this sort of binary between digital and established or legacy media or what have you, but to think about them as part and parcel of public cultural formations for at least 3 to 4 decades.
So in the introduction to the Global Digital Cultures edited volume, we start with two vignettes, two stories. One is a series of films called Coding Culture. In that, there's a particular film called July Boys. This is made in 2006. In that, there's a moment in the film where we have this Bangalore-based software entrepreneur talking about how people like him are, quote unquote, geography agnostic. While the phrase geography agnostic neatly parlays into a Friedman-esque world is flat discourse and other celebratory accounts of globalization, we should also pay attention to the people like him portion of digitalization and how it reproduces certain notions of talent or merit, of center and periphery, and how they end up papering over severe caste, class, gender inequities. So from there, we move almost a decade forward and go to a scene from the American television comedy Silicon Valley. There's in the season 3, episode 9, it's an episode called Daily Active Users. A key conceit of the episode is the idea of click farms, these vast sort of rooms of nameless South Asian men and women clicking on ads, watching the Instagram posts, clicking those likes, ensuring that metrics like daily active users, clicks, and impressions for global digital platforms are boosted. We set these two stories up because this is precisely what we want to move away from flat world, uncritical narratives of globalization and condescending tales of distance and difference. Our broader question then is, how do we de-link the study of internet cultures, or more broadly, the study of digitalization, from its North Atlantic trajectory and lens? At the same time, we also want to avoid an approach that positions South Asia as some sort of exceptional site with irreducible cultural differences that are only magically legible from an Anglophone Western position. So we argue that digitalization marks a global shift with distinct yet connected histories. And as with other moments of media transition, digital cultures in varied national and regional contexts are also shaped by the circulation of ideas, people, technologies, and capital, and are often caught up, and these things are often caught up in deeper histories than popular or academic discourses have so far cared to admit. So we approach South Asia then as a site from which one can examine the intersections of local, national, regional, interregional, oceanic, continental, and global forces that shape contemporary digital culture.
So given that broad approach, one that we see as being grounded in a humanistic and critical media studies framework, we thought we would then turn and think about how media scholars grappled with the centrality of television to new forms of mediation throughout the 1980s and 1990s in different parts of the world. So our move towards thinking about television studies was prompted in part by this sort of sense that digital studies scholars had rather merrily skipped over at least 3 decades worth of scholarship and teaching. And we felt that this becomes particularly problematic when it comes to regions like South Asia or Latin America for that reason, where the work that media and communication scholars have produced was yet again being rendered irrelevant in mainstream digital studies discourse. It's almost as if we had to go through and do the corrective work all over again for a new technological moment. So this model that we have on the screen right now is one that Professor Julie Dijck was a feminist media studies scholar who taught for many decades in Wisconsin. This is a model that was honed through many years of teaching, particularly global television studies, and it builds on cultural studies scholarship, Stuart Hall's work in particular, and it approaches these sites of production, reception, the artifact itself, and the socio-historical context as conjunctural sites, which is to say that each site needs to be understood as being shaped by economic, political, social, and cultural forces, right? So for example, one of the really crucial things that this does is allow us to get away from some sort of facile binary of political economy versus cultural studies. So Dijck, for instance, points out that when we look at the domain of reception, right, when we look at the domain of audience consumption, user practices, and so on, that also is just as much a material site as it is a discursive site, as it is a question of identities, bodies, and so on, right? In other words, the domain of reception is shaped as much by a political economy as it is by other kinds of forces. Secondly, what Dijck also tells us is that the goal is then to try and understand how very specific kinds of meanings get attached to a particular element. It can be gender, it can be religion, it can be generation, and how over time those meanings become hegemonic or they become commonsensical. And we can talk a bit more about this model and why it's been so generative during the Q&A session. But for now, we want to note that this circuit of media study, if you notice, does leave out a couple of crucial elements that become important throughout the late 90s and 2000s. One is distribution, or perhaps even more broadly, circulation. And the second is technology. And in particular, what gets left out is an STS-inflected approach to understanding technology, socio-technical systems, infrastructure studies, that sort of thing. Now, these critiques of this model aside, we were actually far more frustrated to see the emergence of platform studies frameworks or even infrastructure studies frameworks that were developing and acquiring a certain cachet without taking into account not only prior scholarship, but more damningly, without a sense of history. And this is precisely the kind of historical amnesia that John Caldwell cautioned against as early as 2000. He was writing about this when he argued for an approach to digitalization, media, and technoculture as historical formations that are animated as much by continuities as they are by invention. And so we really take that historicizing impulse to heart and try and situate the social and cultural logics of digitalization in relation to deeper histories of media and technology in regions like South Asia. And in doing that, we want to avoid the familiar straitjacket of either technological novelties that travel the world from some select centers to various peripheries, or as somehow inaugurating a decisive break from other media forms. And with that in mind, we try to develop a slightly different model building on the circuit of media study to think about how we might pull these three keywords together of infrastructures, platforms, and publics. And global digital cultures as being formed at the intersection of these three very porous sites, again, conjunctural sites. And while we can't delve into the sort of details of sort of scholarly literature in each one of these nodes, we want to point out that each one of these sites is being shaped by a range of forces, including policy and regulatory practices, industry logics and production practices, and crucially, audience and user practices as well. Right? So very quickly, then we'll do a gloss on these three things before we delve into a couple of case studies to try and illuminate how this model might work for us. So by infrastructures, we of course mean both technical and material things. So your mobile phones, your SD cards, your set-top boxes, your satellites. But we also mean, following Brian Larkin and other scholars, the soft cultural practices that shape the formation of social collectivities and the circulation of media objects and so on. But we also want to play with the term and say that we're interested actually in infrastructuring, right? Which is to focus on the process, the work of producing, maintaining, and particularly in post-colonial societies, repairing and reusing digital infrastructures as an ongoing and continual assembling of all kinds of technologies, business practices, state institutions, and crucially, competing imaginaries. Right? The question of infrastructures and imaginaries is something we want to hold on to and maybe talk more. Because in this particular historical moment we're living through, infrastructuring, you'll all recognize, is as much about enabling and sanctioning some performances of citizenship, for example, getting a biometric identity card. It is just as much about actively disconnecting entire regions from internet and mobile infrastructures. Right? Kashmir being one of the more prominent cases that we know and talk about a little bit. In terms of platforms, we just want to say that this is easily one of the more vexed terms in digital studies, and we have no special purchase or definition to offer. What we will say, however, is that we are most concerned with the uses of platforms, their maintenance, and their influence. In other words, we are interested in practices. Practices by everyday users, by various state entities, industries in different sectors, as well as policymakers. And finally, about publics, we would return to an influential formulation from the early 1990s by Arjuna Padure and Carol Breckenridge, where they point out that public cultures, especially in regions like South Asia, where they identify cinema, television, sports spectatorship, and museums as all coming together to create a very dense, interlinked, and this is the key word, interocular arena in South Asia and other places. So while their critical reworking of publics, publicity, and public spheres inspired numerous studies of media cultures in an era of economic liberalization, think about Purnima Mankekar's work, think about William Mazzarella's work about advertising, and several other scholars, What we are yet to do is fully grasp the implications of the current phase of digital culture, one that is marked as much by vibrant participatory cultures as it is by state and corporate surveillance and data mining practices. And with these three nodes in play, we have one overarching argument to present today and try and work out.
So we argue that digital media cultures in South Asia and beyond are better understood as the product of combustible encounters between emergent data-driven and algorithmic processes on one hand, and representational logics that continue to hold sway in news and entertainment media industries on the other hand. In the interest of time, we want to show you how entering and moving around the circuit that we just showed, that we just introduced, via the site of platforms helps us get at both issues of representation as well as those of algorithmic curation. Through two instances, we hope to show you how practices outlined in the diagram here weave together contingent links between states, global media and technology companies, and audience and user communities. The first story, of course, features Swami Ramdev, who's familiar to some of you. In January 2019, Indian yoga guru and businessman Swami Ramdev, who's in the picture here, filed a defamation suit in the Delhi High Court seeking global injunctions against videos posted about him on Facebook, Google+, YouTube, and Twitter. The judgment in the case, which went in his favor, opened with this statement. For the sake of convenience, the defendants and their various websites, social media platforms, URLs, web links, etc. are collectively referred to as platforms. It was a striking illustration of the extent to which the term platform has, within just about a decade, come to stand in for an entire digital ecology, including massive tech companies like Facebook, specific platforms like YouTube, web-based protocols and things like uniform resource locators, and a wide range of user practices that bring these things together. While the slipperiness of the term platform is often appropriated by technology corporations to avoid public oversight or stringent regulation, the same slipperiness was being deployed against them to get global injunctions against particular content by Swami Ramdev's attorneys. Indeed, media scholars' early interest in digital platforms emerged in part from this sort of stuff, what they afforded user communities in terms of connection, creativity, customization, and exchange. And this story is usually told through the rise of quote-unquote Web 2.0 in the mid-2000s. The excitement around these possibilities was quickly tempered by calls to pay attention to the political economy of these platforms. That is, their ability to profit from vast quantities of data generated through their use, and their increasing influence in determining and shaping legitimate use. The focus on user and audience practices and the extraction of value from its data traces also lines up with contemporary debates on platform imperialism, as Dalion Jin and others have talked about, or platform capitalism and questions of public interest that scholars like Josie Van Dyke and others have spoken about. So this is, of course, we agree that critiques of platform dominance are far from baseless. It is increasingly clear that platform companies, for example, Facebook is the owner and operator of platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, are powerful global economic actors. With state and private investments in digital infrastructures and communication technologies more broadly leading to increased access to the internet world over, it seems hard to imagine a near future without a range of platforms facilitating our social, cultural, political, and economic interactions and exchanges. Moreover, the everyday operation of any given digital platform is also supported by a global labor force. The routine and daily task of content moderation on a platform like Facebook, or even on, let's say, Tinder or other dating apps, for instance, is supported by thousands of underpaid workers in India and Philippines who go through a truly staggering amount of highly disturbing sexist, casteist, racist content. Now, psychological and social toll of such forms of digital labor, as Sarah Roberts and other scholars have argued, often goes unnoticed, but should inform our understanding of digital platforms as constituted by global connections. At the same time, Even as we draw attention to digital labor and other distressing dimensions of how digital platforms operate, there can be no doubt that the same platforms are increasingly central to the production of a meaningful sense of cultural belonging and locality for people the world over. So getting back to the circuit diagram that we talked about, and the sites of platforms and infrastructures and the porosity between them and the exchanges between them, legal battles like the one waged by Swami Ramdev and his lawyers remind us about this very porosity between infrastructures, platforms, and publics. Recently, Facebook's investment in Jio, a network provider in South Asia, one of the biggest, and last week's ban on TikTok in India are two more recent examples of how infrastructures and platforms commingle and acquire the veneer of each other, as Plantin and others have pointed out. Policy and regulatory practices, such as the ban on TikTok in India, are no doubt central to these moves. But it is in entering the circuit through a single site, say platform like TikTok, and moving through the circuit in terms of thinking about its intersections with infrastructures, in terms of regulatory practices, in terms of audience practices, that we really begin to weave through or weave together seemingly diverse threads. In the case of TikTok as a platform, the practice of geopolitics, India's recent skirmish with China, and regulatory action is in lockstep with the socio-political and cultural dimensions of the algorithmically generated homepage, which continues to remain opaque to users and researchers. We rely on leaks and reverse engineering to grasp the industrial aspects of the platform, be it the recommendation algorithms or content moderation guidelines that help some kinds of incendiary content to resurface endlessly. But the audience and user practices, be it the emergence of viral formats or brigading on app stores to reduce ratings when things don't quite pan out, offers other pathways to situate platforms like TikTok amidst rapidly evolving digital media cultures.
A second case that we want to draw attention to as a way to also get away from the India centricity of so much media and communication scholarship, and certainly this has been exacerbated with digital studies scholarship, is to think about YouTube's trajectory in Pakistan. So a few years ago, the lack of a local YouTube implementation, and as a result of that, the kind of lack that both the Pakistani state and the other kinds of institutions that they experienced in efforts to monitor and moderate content, was repeatedly mobilized as the reason for a blanket ban on this platform in Pakistan. And the tensions between the state's impulse to censor content that it deemed blasphemous and Pakistani civil society's opposition to such heavy-handed control of digital and news media then played out in public culture through all kinds of calls to reinstate access to YouTube. So one such key example here is hashtag #KholoBC. Kholo meaning open, and BC being an acronym for an expletive that many people here will not need any introduction to. A campaign that was opposing state censorship as well as content regulation emerged online. It was sparked in part by a viral rap song featuring a comedian, Ali Gul Pir, and a rap artist, Adil Omar. So #KholoBC then ended up becoming this hashtag around which a range of discontent about the limiting of freedom of expression in Pakistan, especially using religion and national security as smokescreens, it came together. And it culminated in a call to action specifically focused on removing the YouTube ban. And this hashtag #KholoBC also involved this really fantastic video that you should watch at some point, involving, it was shot on the streets of Karachi, and it featured a person wearing a YouTube branded cube, walking the streets, holding a sign reading, "Hug me if you want me back." And men and women of range of backgrounds, class backgrounds, different kinds of social backgrounds, are seen then approaching this very friendly cube for hugs as cries of, "I love YouTube, God, please open YouTube again," punctuate the soundtrack. And so what we wanted to do is draw attention to these sorts of instances of social and political ferment and suggest that we need to examine digital platforms themselves as crucial socio-technical sites where state power, corporate interests, and users who are grappling with both the potentials as well as the dangers, the very real dangers, of everyday media use, where these three forces intersect and become infrastructuralized in complex ways, where it is just nearly impossible to imagine life outside of certain kinds of digital platforms in this particular moment in a range of societies. So to do this, we need to pay careful analytic attention to how digital platforms then manage both representational concerns, right, of people creating archives, posting things on YouTube, of the kinds of bodies and ideas that become visible, and on the other hand, algorithmic media logics. So one narrative about publics and platforms that emerge in a place like Pakistan, or India for that matter, is about civil society institutions and the ongoing struggle to establish independence from the state. So in this narrative, in the Pakistani context, the story is always about security, about imposing order, and about maintaining civility. But there is a second and more recent iteration of publics and publicness, one that involves some aspects of private life, right, especially elite life, selectively being made public by a range of new media. And Mobina Hashmi's paper on private publics in the anthology Global Digital Cultures is a crucial one here, where she talks about how crucially television and only recently digital platforms play a role in the formation of these kinds of private publics. And what she talks about is the way in which domestic, private, and intimate concerns emerge into public media spaces and push us in the process to think more carefully about the norms of private conversation and life that erupt into public domains, that really do move us away from well-worn Habermasian ways of thinking about publics and public cultures, and to take seriously both the pleasures and the politics of this kind of intimate private life coming into interrupting public domains, and in the process, reframing what we even might imagine to be, in quotes, the political.
So to wrap this up quickly, we spoke about the combustible encounters between algorithmic processes and representational logics. So by representational, we mean the formal, discursive, affective dimensions of textual and audiovisual content circulating on digital platforms. After all, the Swami Ramdev case in India and YouTube struggles in Pakistan were essentially struggles over spaces, forms, and modes of representation. By algorithmic, we refer to examples like the Facebook's newsfeed or TikTok's the For You page and other platforms' recommender systems that scholars like Nick Seaver and others have spoken about that enable some content to circulate widely in India and across the world. Examples like Ramdev's global injunction lawsuit or Pakistan's YouTube ban, which, by the way, when they instituted that, it took down the internet in various parts of the world for a couple of hours. These reveal the limits of an overarching media or data imperialism argument and push us to explore the more contingent links among states, more voluntarist sort of media and tech companies, and audience and user practices that leverage the strength of numbers. To grasp the dynamics of digital platforms, therefore, calls for engagement with theoretical paradigms and methods that grapple with the specificities of digital infrastructures, platforms, and market dynamics, which Adrian Atik, Vibodh Patsarthi, etc., have recently done some excellent work on. It's important to hold on to the specificities of the digital infrastructures and platforms and the market dynamics within which they're enveloped by, while continuing to draw on media and cultural studies scholarship focused on representation, identity, culture, and power.
So these are some of the concerns that come together across various chapters in this book from which we drew on a little bit for today. And it's worked out in the introduction, but also worked out particularly in a series of chapters that explore these concerns in relation to Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and in the context of Myanmar, which really does take us into a more South Asian inter-regional arena rather than just an India-centric arena. So we wanted to close with that and thank you all once again for listening, for logging in from various parts of the world at very different times of the day. And thank you again to everybody in the Department of Communication at Hyderabad for inviting us and organizing this wonderful roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Aswin, do we want to keep the diagram up, or should we just?
Thank you so much, both of you. With this talk, you developed three broad arguments about the unfolding impact of digitalization across South Asia to show that the coded structures underpinning digital platforms are indelibly cultural and not just technically commercial. So thank you so much for that. We'll have live questions from the Zoom meeting participants shortly. And I'll ask you both the Zoom chat and FB Live common questions towards the end of the meeting. And I request participants now to raise their hands. It's a little icon next to your username. If you can just go down, scroll down, you'll find it. Yes, I can see some people have already started raising their hands. I will announce your names in order. If you can't raise your hand, please let me know that you would like to ask a question via personal message here. Kindly turn on your microphone and or video depending on your connection when it is your turn to ask. And please keep your questions as brief as possible so we can have maximum interaction with the speakers. We will start taking questions now for the next 10 minutes only to manage time better, so please keep that in mind. And we have our first question from Usha ma'am. If you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Thanks, Aswin and Sriram, for that great introduction to the book. And a small plug here. I think everybody should read it because there's so little scholarship of this nature that allows us to enter, this very complex field in our region. And I think, my question really is for those who want to study, any of these aspects of digital culture in the region. The thing is that cultural studies is anyway messy, and your formulation makes it even messier. So how would you advise young scholars to what's the sort of background they would need? Because if you're looking at infrastructures or any of the entry points, you need not only an understanding of cultural studies and the usual media theory and so on that you draw on, but a host of other readings that they need to be equipped with in order to understand the complexity, in as nuanced a fashion as possible. So how would you advise young scholars when they enter a field like this?
This should be a topic for an entire research roundtable, right? But let me return to the argument that Sriram summarized so well, which is we really do want to insist on a critical and humanistic approach, and one that's grounded in a media history that is also contextually grounded, right? So, for example, somebody like Professor Thirumal's work really offers us a model where the entry into this diagram that we have shared on the screen here doesn't necessarily have to be from either a platform-specific, infrastructure or public-specific sort of way. Right. It can be focused more on the question of social phenomena, or a question of social justice, or a question of representational practice, right? Where in the way he talks about the digital dividend, that in very complex and very ambivalent ways gets opened up for Dalit activists, might be the way into this, rather than beginning very broadly from, let's say, a question of Reliance Jio and the infrastructural politics of it and so on, right? So that might be one way to begin to think about this, and not get too caught up in thinking about what are the kinds of technical knowledges one might have to acquire and so on, but instead to say, let's lead with the question that's grounded in certain kinds of social phenomena that are resonant and that are meaningful to any given researcher's situation. And then, of course, as you go through this or any other analytic framework, you then begin to gain a sense of what kinds of literatures, what kinds of specific knowledges you might need to acquire in order to then go through this or any other circuit for that matter. Sriram, does that make sense? Or Usha, yourself, please chime in. Yeah.
That does. The other thing that other inventive example that I can think of in terms of scholarship is somebody like Padma Chirumamila's work, who looks at television repairmen and people who do service repairs in like a Samsung or a other television repair, and then links it to the creation of something like AP FiberNet, and to think about infrastructures in that longer sense through other inventive access points or other inventive participants who we've not thought about as participants in the digital revolution, but are actually in fact, very central to that revolution, so to speak.
Yeah,
So
in fact,
that's
I would
another.
also, throw in Lily Irani, maybe, the way she looks at certain things. Yeah, thank you.
And so if I could add one quick bit, in this previous model, if you'll notice this little floating R up there, that's floating R signifies the researcher, right? So maybe we should add that to this diagram too, is to say that it really depends very crucially on who you are, what your specific objectives are, and what kinds of affective dispositions you bring to any given research project, right?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that. We have the next question from Sriram Chatterjee. If you could please introduce yourself and ask your question. Please unmute yourself and turn on video if possible as well. Sriram, can you hear me? Are you there? Oh, yeah.
Hi. Apologies for the technical difficulty. So, Aswin sir and Sriram sir, I had a question regarding the recent COVID crisis that we are seeing right now. Are you able to see any kind of distinctive themes that have arisen, like anything that was prior to COVID you could see on these platforms, and any kind of new trend or theme that is emerging after these 3-4 months that have happened? So any kind of discourse pertaining to, let's say, the Indian political situation that's there, any kind of distinct trend that was earlier there and now something new is coming up, anything that you've observed?
Do you want me to start us with? Yeah. So one broad theme that I think has animated imaginations of digital scholarship or even public discussions of digital media over the last few years have been the question of misinformation. True. Right? And there's a ton of different stuff, grants and projects and various things, and lots of work happening around that, lots of public discussion around that. I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has done is much like with other social inequities and other social concerns, has really, I think, put the focus back or accelerated responsibilities or accelerated responses to that. So for instance, on YouTube today, if you're a YouTube creator, and if you even mention the word, initially, at least if you were mentioning the word, you'd get demonetized, or you'd have that, and pretty much every video has that tag along with it saying, here's official information, etc. What this does is then, really complicate the questions of expertise, knowledge production, and, what matters, what doesn't matter. And this is where I think our interest in STS scholarship really helps, or the history of science and technology studies scholarship really helps, because they've had to deal with it in multiple moments, not just today. Like this, some of the finest stuff I've read around the pandemic and managing this, for instance, in the American context at least, are people who were working on this stuff during the AIDS epidemic almost in the late 80s. Right? So there's other moments in history where we've had similar troubles. Of course, the media landscape's been very different, but I think bringing that historicized impulse and talking about what sort of inequalities get amplified and magnified, how does our discussion then adapt to that sort of magnification or amplification, I think is something worth paying attention to.
And to connect this back to the question that Usha Raman raised a few minutes ago, another way to think about it is to enter this circuit and enter this analytic framework by thinking about the category of everyday life, right? So daily life or everyday life is this incredibly rich term that has all kinds of theoretical traditions attached to it. And we can begin to see how digital media use in relation to everyday life is being rethought by state institutions, certainly by industry players, especially for those of us in the media studies world, from a media entertainment industry, creative industry sort of perspective. And of course, from a user perspective, all the kinds of creative ways that we are now beginning to reorient our rhythms, our temporalities of everyday life with digital technologies, right? So there's another rich conceptual term to hang on to instead of worrying about, say, TikTok or any other new platform that may be gone in the next 5 to 10 years, right?
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Right, thank you. The next question is from Vinod sir. If you could please turn on your microphone and video.
Yeah. Hi, Aswin and Sriram. Thanks for that presentation and introduction to your book. I have downloaded the book and I'm looking forward to reading it. I mean, some of the work that I do on radio and community radio, looking especially at South Asia, uh, large parts of Africa, uh, you cannot really wish away the very real analog world in which millions of people continue to dwell and function, use for information and entertainment. So I'm just wondering, I mean, whether the digital culture is just a cultural moment, cultural mode, or are we valorizing a certain infrastructure to which many people still don't have access. And you just have to think of the last few months where many of us in South Asian environments are struggling to think of online courses, and we come up against the hard reality that so many of them don't have connectivity. I mean, how do you engage with the very real analog world in which people live? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Do you want to start, Sriram? I'll jump in.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, sir. That's as always great to listen to what you have to say, and of course, I think you're absolutely right, and we entirely agree in the sense that there is severe. I mean, a vast part of the world still doesn't have access to many of the things we're talking about, and I think there is a question. I think there's some serious introspection to be done about whether we're valorizing a particular moment, etc. And our mode of adapt or responding to that or to deal with that has been to look at earlier moments of media transition. Like, for instance, with the radio to TV, that sort of moment, which of course happened in there was a heterotemporal change. It happened at different times in different parts of the world and continues to happen in some parts of the world in very interesting sort of ways. Right. So, and that's been one response to it. And I think the question of access, like you pointed out, vast parts of South Asia, the African continent, but also in what is considered the global north, even in the United States and stuff like that. There are massive communities, rural communities, communities of color, where there's severe inequities with respect to access. So what you raised, in fact, is very clearly a global issue. And there's, of course, also very interesting work on the gender divide with respect to digital access. So I think increasingly important while we enter this sort of thinking about digital media cultures from infrastructures or platforms, etc., is to also think about their negative image of where infrastructures and platforms don't go, and where or what sort of populations are considered not worthy enough or not monetizable enough, or doesn't make business sense to go, etc., and what sort of community collectives and things like that happen. There's some increasingly interesting work being done around platform cooperatives and stuff like that, which in fact is very fascinating to me because it doesn't look at the community radio sort of literature, which has looked at this for years, and that I think is one way to approach it. Aswin?
Yeah, so again, to echo everything that Sriram said, there's no doubt about this question of access as well as the historical novelty part of the equation that you've raised. But so one of the things that we emphasize throughout is that our goal is to think about digital media cultures in two ways. One is it has to be thoroughly inter-medial from the get-go. That's one thing. And second, it has to be also inter-sectoral. So, for example, we have to take seriously the way in which telecom companies and telecom practices work to set up or in some case actively disconnect and deny access, just as much as we think about film and television and other kinds of forms. And the intermediality question becomes really crucial because when we think about it at the level of form, which again is something that I think media scholars can really bring to the table, is to think when we look at a TikTok video, when we look at a YouTube song, a music video, where does the formal element of it come from? where are those formal practices? Where have they been honed? In what other media forms? In what other communities? That are then brought to these kinds of new platforms. So for example, if you look at Peter Manuel's work on cassette culture, you can trace a nice direct link from the kinds of companies he talks about that used cassette tapes during that earlier moment of right-wing mobilization to the current phenomenon of Hindutva pop on YouTube. So a company like Ajanta Musicals in UP, you can trace a direct history to the cassette moment, which is very much an analog moment. So that's the kind of intermediality we need. And in your work on community radio, cooperatives, and the gendered aspects of the divide, obviously need to be taken into account if we want to even engage with an initiative like, for example, Khabar Lehriya. New kinds of journalism that use sound and voice, but bring together the affordances of radio with some very basic but crucial digital platforms, right? So like very simple bulletin board sort of style mode of recording voice and then going from there. So the intermedial historical question is absolutely central to this model. And thank you for that question, because this makes me wonder if we need to add a couple of keywords to this diagram to really make that come through a little bit more.
Thanks, Aswin.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Sriram.
Right, that was great question and answer discussion. Okay, we next have Paul Anthony George. If you can hear me, please unmute yourself. Yeah, if you could please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Paul Anthony, and I'm kind of facing the raw end of the bandwidth stick right now. I think the question is kind of continuing from what you just said, but it's kind of specific in the sense that, have you come across any research that kind of ties in folkloric aspects as well as humor studies and the design of interfaces that would be looking at how means of production, all the way from television content and cinema content up till content that comes on platforms? Because it's very interesting how you mentioned that the gap between scholarship that talks about content from television is suddenly felt when you start analyzing content that is on digital platforms. And it hits hard, largely because I kind of look at internet memes, and suddenly internet memes are these multiple references, and you're kind of pilfering through if there are archives of television content that exists or not, because the people seem to find the references, but research seems to have these lacunae in terms of those references.
Should I start, Sriram?
Go ahead and I'll join in.
Okay. I think I'll just go back to this bit I raised about careful thematic, textual, and formal analysis in a sort of almost archaeological mode is really crucial. So if you take any given sort of meme or a particular YouTube piece of satire on YouTube that's humorous or whatever, we need to be able to go back 2-3 decades sometimes in order to make those connections. But in each case, I think it becomes crucial to say, again, this is why Julie Dachi's model is so crucial, which is conjunctural. It says, why did this particular idea gain force at a specific historical moment? Answering that question in every archaeological dig you do, let's say, right, to use that metaphor a little bit more, is going to be crucial to then understand how a meme that's circulating now pulls together a range of meanings from different historical moments to then come up with a force of that it's its own thing. So I'll give you one quick example. If you look at a video that AIB did during the height of the Aam Aadmi sort of movement, there was a video called Nayak 2, The Hero Rises, right? So looking at that means you will have to go back to the late 90s and early 2000s moment of populism. Look at films like Nayak, in Tamil it was Arjun Mudalvan, where he becomes chief minister for a day, right? So you have to work yourself carefully through not just the Bollywoodized version of it, but also in terms of Tamil and Telugu cinema versions of it, and think carefully about what meanings and forces got attached to that kind of populism in order to understand what's being then done with that. So the figure of the patriarch in Hum Aapke Hain Kaun makes a comeback. So it's that kind of careful textual archaeology, which is slow, that you need even more than, I would say, some sort of big data approach or a certain kind of information studies approach, which gets you different kinds of answers, but not necessarily the questions of meaning, representation, identity. And then to go back to Professor Pavrala's questions of power, inequity, and access as well. Sriram, I don't know if you want.
Yeah, that's pretty much most of it. I can offer some other specific instances if we have time, but if you want to take more questions, we can also do that. I'll leave it to you, Devina. What do you suggest?
So since we have a few minutes left, I would like to take a few Zoom chat and Facebook comment questions. So I'm clubbing these two questions, but you can answer them separately if you'd like. Just posting them on chat here so that you have a ready reference. These are to do with algorithms and the algorithmic dimensions that you mentioned. So Nazneen Sultana, who's a PhD student in the department, is asking for suggestions on methodology that can be used to understand the algorithmic dimensions that you mentioned in your presentation. And Archana Kumari, who works with IIMC, is wondering if we need to focus on algorithms per se to understand the platforms and its humanistic impact. And how important are these technical aspects in studying platform economics?
Go for it.
Yeah. So it's really interesting to see these questions about, and these are questions that seem to come up every time we have any discussion about digital media, especially the algorithmic aspects of this. One thing that I would say is it reminds me of the Langdon Winner article, Do Artifacts Have Politics? I think it's important to think about algorithmic systems as not just about lines of code, but as socio-technical systems that are a range of things coming together. It's about engineers, it's about product managers, it's about assumptions or imaginations or abstractions about what users are, who users are, what they do, why this means something, etc. And you're right. I mean, I think both Archana and Nazneen are right in the sense that the access to them is often very, very hard because a lot of them are proprietary. So, which means there's no sort of audit or whatever. But even if they were available, many of us do not have the technical know-how to parse them. So instead of just getting too worried about whether we're able to address those aspects or not, I think it makes sense to focus on, let's say, the people who create many of these algorithmic systems. That's an entry point. That's a starting point. The other way to talk about it is one of the ways I've approached it in some upcoming work about, music streaming platforms and stuff like that is to look at technical blogs. A lot of large organizations and platforms run technical blogs, and their archives can be very, very useful as well. Then there's sort of really tracing sort of media coverage about or business press coverage about algorithms can actually lead to very interesting outcomes about how discourses about algorithms are produced. So I think we'll have to begin to get more inventive about other windows, other sorts of entry points. And some of those will also have to be done contextually. And again, I cannot stress the importance enough of collaborative work. One person doesn't have to do all of these things. I, for instance, work with some natural language processing people on some other stuff. And I think it's okay to admit that we don't have all of and no one person will have all of the technical know-how or chops or the critical theory sort of chops to make it all happen. And I think collaborative work is the way to go there.
And I would point to Nick Seaver's work as an interesting example here of talking to engineers, for example, not necessarily to understand each line of code, but to understand, for example, what kinds of discussions they were part of even before the design process started, right? As a way to gain insight into a simple question of what was your mandate? What were your stated objectives? What were your stated goals? What assumptions did you already have going into the design process, even before something called an algorithm was produced? And to keep in mind that these are also recursive objects. It's not as if somebody hands you a piece of code, it's not as if it's going to sit there unchanged. Its presence in the world is constant. It's an iterative thing, right? So you're chasing this recursive object. So you're better off chasing the meanings that get attached to it and the politics that's around it, rather than the thing itself, right?
So we have time for one more question. Akhil, if you would like to come online. Akhil, your post. Okay, can you hear me? Or should I just...
We can read the question. Yeah, you can read the question, and I think we can...
Okay, I'll do that. Okay, so Akhil is asking, how does one think of a state-designed or led platform, say like Aadhaar or Arogya Setu? What in your sense is the most useful window to study such systems? I'm not exactly sure what it means.
Should I go ahead, Aswin? And you want to go ahead?
Start and yeah, I'll chime in.
Okay, so I think Arogya Setu is an interesting example, given, and I think a really interesting window to study there. And I think Usha ma'am brought this up earlier, like looking at Lily Rani's work, Chasing Innovation is a good start. And, to think about volunteerist, so Arogya Setu, a large part of the Make My Trip team was involved in its creation, right? So to think about the sort of connections, the sort of volunteerist tech organizations and state intersections, and it's not like this is without precedent. There's a long history of this, both in India, in South Asia, but also in Asia at large. So I think that's a sort of useful window to look at them. Jean Burgess's work in terms of, the walkthrough method is a good way of thinking about interfaces in terms of what assumptions about users, etc., get encoded into interfaces. That's a great other way to approach this. Aswin?
And I would flag another scholar. His name is Andre Brock, whose book has just come out called Distributed Blackness. But he also has this fantastic article in which he lays out a method. He calls it the critical techno-cultural discourse analysis. To be honest, it's not that different from what we are doing in moving from Julie Darcy's circuit of media study for a television world to the digital, where he's saying it has to be critical, in other words, humanistic, critical theory oriented, techno-cultural, paying attention to affordances and infrastructural qualities. And then finally, the discourse analysis, which is precisely his move to say, we don't want big data stuff. He calls it deep data. So to take one piece, for example, one tweet, and to read it closely and to understand the history behind it, understand the linguistic and social norms behind that play with language that happens in a tweet or a meme, those are the kinds of deep dives that he does. And that's another way to approach a particular app. And with something like Aadhaar, there's a huge body of scholarship now, not just on Aadhaar, but in the South African context, in other parts of the world. So Keith Breckenridge's work on the biometric state would be a good book to pick up as a way to really put these in a long historical context that is inevitably also a colonizing and colonial framework in which to understand state practices of enumeration, creating population definable management. Communities, population management, coming out of a fuzzy sort of understanding of populations to what Arjun Upadhyay calls a very enumerable way of thinking about citizens and welfare services and all the rest of it, and the very dark sides of that kind of enumeration as well. So with something like Aadhaar, Tarangini Sriram's work at Azim Premji University of a history of identification documents, of paper trails, document trails, becomes really crucial when we think about what unfolded in Assam, for example, with CAA and NPR, right? Where the fight over identity becomes a fight over documents itself, papers, pieces of paper lost and found, and so on.
And Ritika Kera's work, there's a whole bunch of scholarship, like Aswin said. I think a wide variety of scholarship has developed on Aadhaar and other biometric identification systems. And we hope to see more as well, I suppose.
If you're looking for a specific portal, I think CIS is also not bad. Akhil.
Yeah. And I'll flag that somebody who's on this call is doing very interesting fieldwork right now in South Korea, Youngrim Kim, around precisely this kind of state-driven, but also some sort of public-private partnerships around health-related apps, especially in relation to the COVID crisis that somebody else raised earlier. So Youngrim Kim, who's on this call, would be another person to follow and learn from her work in the Korean context.
Yeah, and we can vouch for the fact that Kim, she was interested in this much before COVID hit. So she's been thinking about this for longer.
A long time.
Right. Thank you so much, Ashwin sir and Sriram. This is all the time we have for today. Here's what's happening next Monday. We meet Dr. Somrita Ganchaudhary, who will discuss communication negotiations among civil societies for HIV/AIDS in India. And the meeting will be held at noon as usual. Thank you so much for joining us today. See you next Monday.
Thank you, everybody, again for joining and for all the amazing questions and comments.
Thank you so much.